All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Comics for All. Today is Tuesday, November 4th. Wherever you are, thank you for joining us today. Happy Election Day if you're in the U.S., but a lot of elections going on. But today I am joined by Shawn Hainsworth of SHP Comics. Shawn is here to talk about all things comics and everything like that. So, again, Comics for All is where comics, creativity, and community all connect. So, Shawn, thank you for taking some time out of your busy day and your schedule to join us. The first question I always like to ask is, how in the heck did you get into comics as a reader, number one? And then how did you get into comics as a creator?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so as a reader, so I was not like a big comic reader when I was little. I was much more of a Mad Magazine kid, that sort of thing. I think there were two books that really kind of grabbed me. One was Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which
Oh,
just blew my mind of what was possible within a graphic novel in terms of content. And then Watchmen kind of blew my mind as to, just the complexity and the sophistication of the visual storytelling. I was just hooked on Watchmen from the first couple pages, just the blood splat on the smiley face and the pull up into the window. And it was, and just, I thought the writing was amazing. I mean, I think Alan Moore's, one of the greats. So those sort of pulled me in. I was definitely, kind of more of an alt kid. I read, Eight Ball, Dan Clowes's Eight Ball, and but we read like Matt Wagner's Mage. We were into Matt Wagner and
mm-hmm.
Hellboy. So definitely more in the indie vein. I was never a big superhero guy. I think Watchmen is superheroes, but it's a different take on everything.
Right.
So yeah, I never really got the superhero gene for whatever reason, but just once I realized what was possible in the medium, both in terms of content and in terms of form and art and visual storytelling, and just what can like everybody, I read Scott McCloud's comic, How to Read Comics book or whatever it's called, and it was just wonderful to see someone articulate in detail all of the things that you're sort of processing, how much
Mm-hmm.
time is passing between panels and, just all of the ways that we learn to read these stories. And that, yeah, I was just hooked. Like then at that point, I just found it like to be a really complete separate thing that I loved, separate from movies or other, or novels or other forms of storytelling.
Love that. And that kind of leads right into my next question is that was there a particular point in time or an event that kind of sparked your interest in getting into the indie comics scene?
Yeah, absolutely. So so I studied film in college, and I ended up making a bunch of documentaries back in the 90s. I studied documentary filmmaking, and so that was great. And I learned a lot of, I think, about story structure, because in a documentary, you sort of, we made more sort of fly in the wall, observational type documentaries. So the footage you get, you have to structure. You don't control it. You don't write a script. And in a way, you really have to focus on structure. How am I going to take all these things that happen and put them together? Um, uh, but I was always writing stories. I was always writing short stories, always starting novels, always, tapping away on a screenplay.
Mm-hmm.
But then I had kids, and I started a business, and, for about 15 years, I was just kind of heads down, being a dad and running my business. Um, but then as I started to come out of that, sort of around COVID, had more time, started writing again more seriously, wrote Woodstake as a screenplay, and got into the Austin Film Festival with it and went there. And while I was there, I was just like, you know what? I don't want to do this. Like screenwriting is just a drag. It's like it's just and you don't own your intellectual property, right? Generally, when you sell a screenplay, you kiss all the rights goodbye. You have
Yep.
no control over how it gets made, if it gets made, when it gets made, what it looks like, So as a creator, I feel like, I want to control this thing. I want to, bring to life what I wrote in my way. And so I was like, I'm going to do this as a comic or, slash graphic novel. And I just kind of jumped into the deep end. Like I just went online and I looked for artists, and I was lucky enough to come across Felipe Kroll, who ended up being, I think, the perfect artist for Woodstake. And you know, I had a screenplay. So at first I was sort of adapting it. But then, you know, I really began, you know, when I was really learning how to write a comic book. And I actually wrote, you know, so Woodstake, the original issue one didn't quite work. And I wasn't happy with it because I was still learning the process. So I scratched that and created a prologue and a new issue one. So I sort of went back and rewrote. But once I got into the way of writing comics, and the joy of working with an artist, right? Because you know,
Mm-hmm.
I'll write these pages and panels up, and then Felipe will come back, or one of the artists will come back with sketches, and then you get to talk about that, and they bring their vision to it, and they bring, you know, the artist brings so much to it, that it's just kind of a joy to work that way. And so yeah, I never look back. I had other ideas, and I was like, I'm gonna do this one way or
I love
another.
that though.
Yeah.
Because it gives you, like you said, that sense of control where you have control over production, how long it takes, artists. You have all that ability to control and what comes out in the final product. Your slogan, "Comics on the Edge." What does that mean to you as a publisher and a creator?
Yeah, so what that means to me is I really try to the stories that I've written so far, you know, I think they're all kind of unique. They're either genre mashups or they're a unique take on something. You know, so for me, Comics on the Edge means every comic that we put out has got an edge to it, and every comic we put out is not going to be like other comics on the shelf. Like I really
Uh-huh.
want our comics to be different. When you buy an indie comic, you're not looking for, you know, a standard typical comic. Nothing wrong with Marvel, DC, Boom, Image. They produce great stuff.
Yep.
And you know, and there's a lot of indie comics out there on Kickstarter and, you know, whatever, that are also kind of original or unique. But that's really what we're trying to do, is tell unique stories that wouldn't necessarily otherwise be told, or told in that way. We also try to use really interesting young artists, and all of our books have very different looks. And so, you know, so our kids book Ziki is, you know, a Western manga mashup, and we have
Mm-hmm.
two different artists working on it. Felipe's process we'll talk about is very unique. And then Jeff Kroshik with Aerotech, you know, that's a totally different style. So, you know, I really hope that each comic you pick up from SHP, it surprises you. It looks unique, and the story is from a unique perspective, and it feels a little edgy. So, Comics on the Edge.
Hey, I love that. It's a great marketing ploy too, I feel like. So kind of just a general excuse me, of SHP Comics. How do you select which genres and stories to publish? You know, like you said, you've got horror, sci-fi, comedy, and kind of and 18 and older themes too. How do you go about selecting what titles and things to go with?
Yeah, so I mean, right now the titles all came out of my head, right? So I wrote all of them. So you know, I had a lot of stories, you know, wanting to be a writer for, you know, 15 years while I was running a business and raising my kids. I had a lot of ideas, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, I'm gonna put my ideas into production, and so I don't really necessarily think within a certain genre. So you know, each idea came from a unique place, and I just, you know, followed them. But now, as SHP is growing, and as we're starting to get into the graphic novel market, and I'm really taking on the role of being a publisher,
Yep.
you know, I have acquired, or, you know, a couple titles. So when I went to the Frankfurt Book Fair this year, as, you know, someone looking to license other people's material, and
Uh-huh.
that was really interesting, because I had to say, okay, so I like my stuff, right? And that's, I know my stuff is on brand, but what else is on brand?
Right.
And honestly, so I'm working on something now we can talk about a little bit, that's more, has, you know, sort of more of a foothold in a, you know, literary tradition, and potentially a comic book tradition. And you know, and I do really like the idea of sort of reinventing classics, or just dealing with more sort of classic or literary material.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't unfortunately talk about the two books that I acquired when I was at Frankfurt, because the deals are not done, and I don't want to talk out of school.
Fair.
um But one of them is is a really unique creator funded graphic novel, about essentially a great American author that's been somewhat forgotten. Really great story, and I just fell in love with the book. If I read a book in one sitting, then that's a great sign, right? Just didn't put it down, just went all the way through it. And the other one, still negotiating, but it also has a classic literary quality to it. And so I like, building out the brand in that way. Now, these are not like typical adaptations of classic
Hmm.
material. There's always going to be an edge, right? There's always going to be a different perspective, a different take, and also I think the artwork on both of these is really great. One of them is a classic Spanish illustrator who's still alive. He's in his 80s,
Oh yeah.
and someone that I would like to bring more into an English speaking world, because I don't think as many people know him, and I think he's a great artist who people should know. So that's the other thing about publishing, other people's work, is to bring artists to light that you really like. And I
Very
really
much so.
resonate with this guy's work. So yeah. So that was interesting. I'm starting to really think about the brand in a broader way right now, and to think about graphic novels, like one of these books that I'm acquiring is just going to be a graphic novel. It will not be single issue comics.
Yep.
The other one may be single issue comics and then a graphic novel. But it's nice to think in terms of both.
Absolutely, and especially once you hit the graphic novel or the trade paperback format, that's where libraries, we love those. We
Yeah.
by and large, libraries won't buy the single issues because they just don't hold up to being checked out and stuff. But if you can reach the trade paperback format, we will buy those all day long.
Yeah, and I've been really courting the library market. I mean,
Yes.
I was at the ALA this year. I had a booth at the ALA. I've been doing outreach to librarians, because I love libraries, right? And I mean, libraries are critical. We have to support them, particularly now. We have to support them.
Yes.
And yeah, I mean, I feel like both the titles. I'm not putting the adult title out there for libraries,
Right.
but the kids title, the manga western mashup, the fantasy we'll talk about. That's I think going to be a great title, and will really stand out on the shelf because
And you'd be
um,
surprised too. There's actually a lot of libraries, like my last library, we actually had an adult graphic novel section that had nudity or sex or different things in there. So there are a lot of public libraries that are dedicating collections for that only adults can read.
yeah, and I've actually talked to librarians who've said adult graphic novels is a growing area.
Very
So,
much so.
yeah, so Woodstake I feel is right in there. I mean, Woodstake is not a kid's graphic novel. We put it at 16 plus, so I would call
Hmm.
that adult. But yeah, no, I love libraries. And so that's also been great. Like the comics market, from a business perspective, comic book stores are great, and they have great community, and they have passionate fans, but there's not that many of them, and it's harder to reach a wider audience, and libraries just throw the doors open to
Yes.
a much wider community that will read graphic novels that maybe doesn't read single issue comics, and independent bookstores as well.
Right. And I feel like too in like independent bookstores and libraries in particular, you get more of that discovery experience. You find
Yeah.
things that you may not otherwise think you would pick up, just walking into a bookstore, where a bookstore you got to buy it when you leave with it, where you walk into a library, oh, I want to try that and see if I like it
Yeah,
for free.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And the great thing, the other thing that's hard for comic book retailers is that they have limited shelf space and they have
Yep.
no returns, right? So if you take a chance on a new series and it sits on the shelf, you've eaten that money, right? And
Hmm.
independent bookseller, there are returns, but comic book stores, I mean, some of the retailers are playing around with returns, but it's a bigger lift for an independent comic book store to pick something up unless they know, oh, Joe will want this and Sarah will want this. They know their readers, right? That's what I love about comic book stores.
Oh
And they
yeah.
will pull stuff and put it in somebody's pull box because they know they'll like it. But beyond that, it can be risky to put stuff on the shelf that may not move. So,
That's right.
yeah, it's been a real education, sort of learning, the different markets and everything. I've been now, in addition to going to comic cons, I've been going to book fairs and trying, and the ALA conference, and really trying to learn the different markets and the different audiences and what people are looking for.
That's right. Um, And shout out to that too, because that's one thing I would like to share, that every single state has a library association. So find
Yes.
whatever state association, attend those two, attend the national one, ALA. And then the third one I wanted to shout out was the Public Library Association has their
Yes.
own conference every 2 years. And that
Oh, I
one's
didn't realize that was every 2 years.
yeah,
Yeah.
that one's every 2 years, and it's in Minneapolis coming up in April. So if anyone wants to try to get on there, I think they, like you said, they do the artists and writers and publishers pretty early on, but be on the lookout for the next cycle. I want to go ahead and shift to more of your creative process and putting together anthologies. Can you share some insight into your collaborative process for projects such as Aerotech?
Yeah, so Aerotech, for people who don't know, is an office comedy about a Silicon Valley startup that makes sex robots that need more debugging, right? So it's basically an office comedy. Think of The Office or Silicon Valley, but the product is sex robots, and the humor just kind of flows from there, right?
Right.
So there's just tons of fun scenes, but it really tries to be a very character-driven office comedy that has got more than just a bit with a sex robot. Right, we've got lots of bits with sex robots, but beyond that, we try to have a real story. That all started because I wrote a short story way back when, called Technical Support, about it's basically an unboxing video about a man who gets a sex robot delivered, and then as he's using it, it starts to glitch, and in dominance mode, with the whip and the boots, and he has to call technical support. It's like the most uncomfortable technical support conversation, but she has to ask for his customer number and his PIN and all that stuff. Right, so that was super fun, and I realized that that beyond Aerotech, just the world of sex robot stories could be really interesting, and it could also just expand with different creators who have different perspectives, right?
Yes.
So a lot of this also, I work very closely with Jeffrey Kroshik, the artist for Aerotech, and he's just a great guy, and he's really committed to indie comics, and he knows a lot of indie creators. So we had so much fun doing technical support, or the comic is called the SEX 6000. We made a short film out of it called Technical Support. We decided we're going to do an anthology and throw it open. And the only rule, so we found creators we thought were cool. that was the only thing. And that came from different perspectives, right? So we have, different sexual perspectives, different, people from different countries, just lots of perspectives. We didn't want it to be all, female robots and all, kind of male customers or whatever. We wanted it to be just, more open. And so we found 8 creators, and the only rule was that the story has to have a sex robot, and the sex robot has to be anthropomorphic, right? You can't have a 9-tentacled squid creature because,
Right.
right, that would just be off brand for Aerotech, right? So Aerotech is the center of it. And then Jeff and I had a great time. We came up with this salesman, Dick Randy, who's the salesman for Aerotech, who, kind of introduces the stories and walks you through it, and is sort of like the guide figure through them. And so we got Dean Haspiel, did a great story called AI Joe. We got Katie Mansfield, who did something called Killer Sex Bot, and we just got a Chloe Brailsford, who does a lot of Boom and DC work.
Yes, I recognize your name.
Yeah, she was great too, because she was just like, because we said, Chloe, you can do anything you want. You've got 6 pages, you can do anything you want with a sex robot. And she was like, really? I've never been told I can do anything I want and get paid for it before. And she's just was such a champion of this project, like posting about it. Yeah, she was great. But all the artists in there, they all took it in a different direction. There's like straight up horror. There's, pretty much straight up comedy, and, everything in between. There's one that's got a political edge to it. And Dean's is, called The Day Away, which is based on the Annie song. So, it goes in all these different directions. So super fun. I loved the idea of moving to curator as opposed to writer. And once again, that helps me develop the brand and build outside of myself. Because, I was the Colonel that started, Colonel Kernel, that started SHP Comics, but I don't want to be, the only voice. I want it to be,
Right.
kind of broad and inclusive. And so Tales from Aerotech was a great way to do that. And Aerotech does really well. That's our best Kickstarter audience. And, our Kickstarter backers have been really great. And we almost almost broke even.
That's
So
actually a
yeah.
great follow up to my next question, and you've touched on it a little bit. But how what's your approach or process in bringing together artists and writers for these different types of projects?
Yeah, so a lot of it is who I know or who Jeff knows or who we
Hmm.
discover in Artist Alley, right?
6 degrees of
So
separation.
yeah, Katie Mansfield was somebody I just saw her booth at San Diego and like 2 years ago, and I just walked up to her and said I like your work. We're going to be doing this independent anthology. Would you be interested? And took her business card and that was that. Jeff, there's this German artist who's got the marvelous name of Fufu Fruenwald, um,
Oh,
who's a friend of Jeff's in Berlin. And he just did an ad page, like a really marvelous Elon Musk send up ad page. That's the other thing. Tales from Aerotech not only has the stories, but we did all these fake ads. And Jeff loves researching old ads from the 30s and 40s and 50s. And so yeah, we have artists who do just fake ads in there. But so Jeff knew Fufu. Chloe, I forget how we found Chloe. It may have been Jeff. But yeah, just and Dean, I had met at a con and I've always admired Dean's work. Dean is at a lot of cons. He is the hardest working man in independent comics. And he's just the nicest guy. And so at like two or three cons, I was talking to him just about life, comics, Kickstarter, and trying to make a living at all this nonsense. And so he was a natural ask for this because his stuff fits in. We knew he would knock it out of the park with something weird.
right.
So yeah, it was just that. It's really just, you start to expand your community. We were lucky enough to get Flops, who, has done covers for Something is Killing the Children and I think he's like on the edge of superstardom. Tales from Aerotech are the first interior pages he's ever done. So that was
Oh, okay.
great. Like we got a superstar, rising superstar. He was also a joy to work with, and his stuff is amazing. If you don't know Flops, go look up Flops
I'm
because
definitely going to.
you will know Flops. He's that good.
Well, I've read
So
Something is Killing the Children, so I've probably seen some of the covers you're
yeah, he did some
talking
of the
about.
covers for those. Yeah, and what he does in Tales from Aerotech is like this marvelous kind of retro style, just detailed, but also could have been an ad from an old newspaper. Saturated colors, but the detail is great. The line work
Right.
is great. He's tremendous. Yeah.
And this is actually a question for you, kind of being the head person of SHP. What challenges do you face in curating, multi-creator anthologies and maintaining kind of that voice, like you're saying, of SHP and kind of maintaining that brand as well?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So part of what happened with Tales from Aerotech is that our deal with the artist was do anything you want. Right. um and I love doing that. I love saying to a creator, I will pay you a page rate to do anything you want. That's a unique offer. Not a lot of
Absolutely, yeah.
not a lot of artists get that kind of offer. So with that said, I had to say whatever they produce we put in the magazine. It this is Tales from Aerotech is I don't know if it's on brand. It's out there. It is like filthy, right? In a lot of ways. It's very sexual. It's very, it's out there.
Hmm.
It's beyond the edge,
Yes,
right?
it is the edge.
It is the edge. So that was my one concern. I've got an age 9+ title called Ziki, the Wrath of the Rat King, and I'm pushing that out there to readers 9+, and then I've got this title that's filthy, right?
Yep.
So that was like, okay, I want to do that. I want to be a publisher that can go mature, and we have different imprints now. We have SHP Mature and we have SHP Kids, and then plain old SHP on the edge, for things in the middle. Yeah, there's been a lot of soul searching in terms of what is SHP. But I think one of the things that SHP is I would love to be a place that publishes independent voices that don't get to tell their own stories. Chloe's a
Yes.
marvelous artist and you can see all of her work for Boom, but she doesn't get to write her own story and have it published anywhere. I love being the publisher that did that. I want to curate but not over curate, in a way. I think the fact that this is so out there and so on the edge, it is sort of on brand, but the
Hmm.
the brand needs to expand into, we have a very mature aspect of the brand that's on the edge, and we have a kids aspect that's also on a different edge, a light edge, a fun
Right.
edge. Yeah, a genre melding but fantasy oriented edge, right? So what is the edge? Everything's got an edge, but that edge shifts with mature, and kids. um
Absolutely.
but yeah, sometimes I'm like, what the hell am I doing? Like, what is my brand? But you only find it by doing it, right?
That's right.
And like, if you do something that's off brand, or that you feel is taking you in the wrong direction, then you pull it back in and say, okay, wait, that was not where we want to go.
Right.
But we're not corporate. We're not, what sells the most copies? What do the kids want to read today? What's popular? That's not us. We're like, what can we do that's interesting, unique, and different, and gives voices to other indie creators? And if we
Yes.
can do that, you know, good for us. You know.
That's a great transition to kind of talking about actually some of your titles. We've touched on Aerotech, and that's kind of the one I'll start with. In terms of Aerotech, indie creators and provocative themes, obviously. Was there any particular messages or ulterior motives that you're hoping readers take away from the anthology?
Yeah, I think what I really like about Aerotech is that it kind of brings, as I like to say, office politics meets sexual politics meets sex robots, right? So the main character is a young female executive, smart and but young, and has a lot to learn personally. And the company that she ends up working for, Aerotech, has got a, kind of a misogynistic bro culture. Nobody wants to take her seriously. She's navigating these kind of tricky waters of sexual politics within the office politics of being a young female executive, and having to work with, a co-manager who's a puerile asshole, and a boss who's out to lunch, and
Oh man.
so it's, I really like the idea of sexual politics meets sex robots, right? I think there's a lot to mine in there.
Oh yeah.
And to give the story more thematic relevance, where it's not just, a bunch of fun with sex robots. There's nothing wrong with a bunch of fun with sex robots, but I want every story to be, well structured, well thought out, thematically relevant. I hold myself to a pretty high standard writing. Now I may be deluding myself, as a lot of people do, but I would like to think that I hold myself to a high standard of writing. I really try to think through these things and really try to make sure that there's a complete, satisfying story where the plot points make sense, the characters are interesting, and it's about something other than just telling a story.
Right. The artwork can be great, but if the story's crap, then
Exactly. You don't get past issue 1 or 2. You're like, wow, this is great art, but I don't feel like reading this anymore.
that's
Right?
right.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
next we'll dive into Woodstake.
Yeah.
What was the kind of the inspiration for blending vampires, rock and roll, and Woodstock? I find that premise fascinating. I want to read it now.
Yeah, that it was super fun. I mean, so he was a child of the 70s, basically. I was born in 1966, so I kind of came of age in the late 70s and the 80s, and we kind of were in the shadow of the hippie generation. Everybody
Hmm.
was so, revered Woodstock and the hippies and blah blah blah, but we were also trying to define ourselves, as being different than the hippies. Anyway, I was always interested in hippie culture, and I actually, one of the documentaries I made was about refugees from the Vietnam War. So I lived in a refugee camp in the Philippines. I made a documentary about Southeast Asian refugees. So I got real deep into the Vietnam War at one point. Sort of reading a lot about that, and not to go too far into it, but what that meant for the country, what that, there's the Vietnam was just such a major turning point in the history of this country.
It was.
Um, and then I was reading a book about Woodstock by Michael Lang, who was the organizer, called The Road to Woodstock. And just, it was one of those bolts out of the blue. Woodstock, Woodstake, a vampire at Woodstock. It just kind of hit me. The pun hit me. The series comes from a pun. I have to admit it. Um, but then I started imagining, like, a vampire who just, like, is the most cynical, soul-sucking creature in the universe meeting the optimism of the peace and love generation, and the scenes just started to flow. Like I just felt like this is it, and it was a great way to look back on the hippie generation, because
Right.
there was so much optimism and peace and love, but on the other hand, it was so naive, right? There was so much of it that was so naive, and obviously, the world we live in is not the world that the Flower Children imagined. And having sort of the vampire not only just be a force of evil, but like being kind of the voice of like commenting on the absurdity of these peace and love values and ripping them to shreds, literally and figuratively, would just seem like a great way to explore the era. And so, my main characters, so the thing about the hippies was that, by the 80s, the hippies were the yuppies, the peace and love generation had turned into the make as much money as you can generation. And so, I had my main three characters kind of are three different, arcs. So one of them is kind of like the hippie who's really committed to the cause, but is going to be a sellout in 20 years,
Yeah.
right? And my main character is like the one who's like the soul of the story, is the one who really believes, all of the believes in everything, believes in peace and love, believes that it's possible. Like it's the true hippie in the good sense. And then, John is like just an opportunist. So, yeah, it was fun to sort of take those three characters through, because I think once again, there's a lot of thematic relevance about wanting to change the world, not being able to change the world, losing your vision on what you even wanted to change in the first place. And then
Right.
slamming that up against the vampire was just too much fun. So yeah, that's where it came from.
Now I'm definitely gonna check it out.
I will
Third
absolutely
title.
send you PDF readers of all of these. So and if you want physical copies, let me know and I will drop them in the mail, because
Okay.
you, my friend, are in the press and you get free copies.
Hey, I definitely am in the press at this point.
Yeah.
So the third title we're going to talk about is The Killing Machine.
Yep.
This one, from what I could gather, actually took a while to complete this one.
Yeah.
What kept you motivated to see it through, and what sets this space opera separate from other sci-fi?
Yeah, great questions. So I started writing this as a novel like in 2007. I had this idea, and the idea changed a lot over time, but the original idea was I was watching a lot of samurai movies, as one does. And I had this idea, the idea of a masterless samurai is just a wandering samurai who is now under the control of no one. And I had this idea of a robotic soldier that just had been utterly cut off from mission control and was now just wandering the universe as,
Right.
kind of like a wandering robotic AI samurai. That was the original idea. And I started writing the series, the novel up, and I got 250 pages into it, and I kind of hit the wall and wasn't sure what to do with it. Had a lot of ideas, but hadn't figured out how to coalesce it. And then, fast forward to when I started the comic book company, and I was like, okay, now I need to reboot this. And when I went back, I really found it. I found the ideas that had been missing. And part of it was that I'd gone back and really been rereading some of some of the classic, really cerebral, kind of thought provoking, pushing the edge of, human experience sci-fi, Arthur C. Clarke and others. And I
Oh
also
yeah.
found, the three body problem, and I
So
can't
good.
pronounce. Yeah, Leo Sixin. I don't know how you pronounce his name, but just a genius. Like, just blew my mind. Did you get to Death's End?
Yes, I read all
Death's
three.
End was like, it was so mind blowing, and there were so many amazing ideas coming out of his prose. Like every chapter kind of blew your mind again and again and again.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that kind of inspired me to make something that was bigger, more cerebral, more sort of mind blowing. And so that so it was really hard to do that in a comic, right? Because um I really try to minimize my dialogue, right? Nobody wants to read, too many words on a page in a comic book that's a visual medium, right? It has to tell
Right.
the story visually. And so, but if you're going to get into hard science and big concepts, how are you going to do that without a lot of words? It's difficult. And
Yeah.
so and also structuring the story was really difficult. Uh because it essentially, the original idea was, I know people haven't read it, but it's like sort of one long battle over like 14 hours that keeps dipping back into time, revealing more and more of this sort of deep concept. So as a writing challenge, it was really difficult. And it came together really well. But what's interesting is after I finished the comics, when I wrote the graphic novel, I restructured the whole thing and I made it more
Okay.
chronological rather because I felt like the flashbacks were just too much. So I still kept working on the story even after the comics were done because it's a really hard story to tell. But at the end of the day, I'm really proud of it. I think it is what sets it apart is that it is really cerebral, has some really cool ideas in it, has an epic cliffhanger at the end. So I hope that this finds a good audience in the graphic novel and I can go back and write book two because there's a lot more to say with this story. But it also has a lot of action and good characters. Like nobody wants to just read cerebral stuff. I mean, it works better in prose.
Hmm.
Solaris, one of the great science fiction books of all time, but not a lot of action. But you can't do
Right.
that in a comic book, right? A comic book of Solaris would be impossible.
Have
So
you ever
there's a lot
approached
of
the idea of like doing like a light novel where it's kind of like the illustration with like a full page of prose
I,
following it?
yeah, I have, and I actually have also thought about I've written like the first arc as a short story. So yeah, because I really like the way the comic has come out, but clearly you had to slim down some of the ideas and some of that. And I would like to revisit it in either a light prose format or some other format down the road.
Okay.
I feel like the story has a long way to go in my brain.
Right.
But I'm already 10 years in on this thing, right? So there's a lot. I think it really holds together. I think it will surprise people. I think it will each issue in the comic and each chapter in the graphic novel, kind of pushes you further. Nothing like what Six in Liu does. I can't blow your mind that much, but kind of expands your mind, expands the possibility, expands where you are, expands the reach, both in terms of science and thematics. So this one is not coming out to the fall. I decided to launch the graphic novels just with um the kids book Zicky and Woodstake, and I'm holding Killing Machine and Aerotech for the fall because I feel like this one needs more of a marketing campaign.
Hmm.
People who love sci-fi, but it can be a harder sell outside of that. Hopefully the libraries will come to my rescue because every library's got a bunch of sci-fi fans.
Yes, we all do.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, that's that one. That's the big complicated one. But I'm very proud of that book.
I'm
I worked
fascinated by it. I definitely
harder
want to
on
get a
that one
copy.
than I worked on any other.
Love
Put
to
it
hear
that way.
that.
Yeah.
Now we're going to try to transition more onto the business publishing side of things.
Yeah.
Um, Especially as a publisher, how do you balance, putting out stories like you're saying that meet multiple age groups? How do you not have everything that's 18 plus, or how do you not have everything that's kids? How do you balance kind of putting out titles where you have a nice wide audience? They have things to select from, I guess I should say.
Yeah. It's hard and it requires a longer runway for
Yep.
people to know who you are, right? So if you publish nothing but horror titles, people know who you are. They know that SHP or whatever equals horror. They know what they're going to get, and it's easier to establish your brand. I'm trying to establish a brand that's like, hey, you may like horror, you may like science fiction, you may like, sex robots, but we'll go anywhere. But we're offering you what I think is a level of, uniqueness and quality that sets us apart. That's a
It
much
is.
harder sell. I think once we find those fans, we'll have passionate fans who will follow
Mhm.
us anywhere, right? I loved the Woodstake, so I'm going to read The Killing Machine, or I loved Aerotech, so I'm going to read Woodstake, or whatever. Even though I don't always read horror, this sounds interesting, and I feel like this brand delivers, and that's a harder sell. So I've got to give myself more runway for that, right? Before the brand kind of clicks in. What I've learned. So what's interesting is I'm so glad I've worked. At first I was just publishing comics and I was publishing through Diamond, and then Diamond went boom,
Yep, that's a
um,
whole thing.
kaflooey, and I was in the wilderness with 93 other small, publishers trying to find my way. Thankfully, I found my way to Massive, and I'm now in Massive through Lunar, which is great. They don't do Canada like Diamond did Canada, and they don't do the UK like Diamond did the UK. So the comic distribution world is still reeling from all the changes.
Oh yeah.
Um, and what I realized is that there's not nearly as big a market for kids comics these days, right? I mean, the comic, there are some stores that do a great job selling kids comics. But by and large, I think the readership of comics tends to be older. There's definitely a market for mature titles, right?
Yep.
That's like baked into the counterculture aspect of comics and alt comics being
Oh
available
yeah.
in head shops and Crumb and Art Crumb and people pushing the envelope and drawing dirty shit and
The
stuff you
Comics
can't see
Code.
anywhere else. The comic fighting back against the comics code, all of that. So there's definitely an audience to mature. So I guess what I'm realizing is that um, I'm going to emphasize certain titles potentially in certain markets. So the kids title, really working hard with the librarians because I think a unique YA graphic novel can be a home run in libraries.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I'm working Aerotech a lot with the direct market comic retailers, and I put off the standard independent bookseller market because just for the fall, I need more time to research it. The market for adult, not just adult, but adult 18 plus graphic novels in independent bookstores, I believe is pretty small.
Yep.
So I'm trying to figure that out. But I think what it is it's, you know, building your social channels, finding your audience, cultivating your audience through Kickstarter, and then developing the books in the channel or distributing the books in the channels where they make the most sense. Right.
That's right.
Yeah. And so chasing, not chasing the wrong market for the wrong book. And now that I can be in comics, independent booksellers, and libraries, and then also licensing the content to foreign language publishers, right? Because it works
Yes.
both ways. So when I was in Frankfurt, I was also talking to European publishers because Aerotech is a good fit for European comics, right? They're much less uptight about dirty stuff,
Hmm.
and there's definitely a market for it. So the trick is many pokers in many fires, right? Kickstarter,
Good analogy.
comic retailers, foreign licensing, independent booksellers, libraries. Somehow you find enough of a fan base, and somehow over time, people come back and say, I like what you do, and I'm going to try something in a different genre. And eventually, hopefully, you have people saying, I love SHP comics. I hope we get there, before
And,
we
and you're well
smack
on your
into a
way
wall.
too. And
Mm.
you touched on actually the next question I had is, in your experience, what has been the most effective way in reaching new readers? Has it been like comic book stores, like you said, an online storefront, attending conventions, or even like your local library and social media?
Yeah, so I have to say, it all partially depends on what you put into it. Each channel depends on what you put into it, right?
Right.
So, definitely going to Comic Cons. You don't sell a lot of books at Comic Cons. You really don't. As an
Mm-mm.
independent creator, you're in Artist Alley with 150 other cool independent creators. And of the people who are at Comic Cons, not a ton of them are looking for new indie comics, right? A lot of them are there for fan service, or they're into, movies or meeting people or meeting their favorite artists, and all
Yeah.
that is great. But even though you don't sell a lot of comics, you meet a lot of really interesting people. Just sitting back there and
Totally.
talking to the people who come up, it's great. You meet other artists. So I love Comic Cons for community, right? Better, more than sales. Doing signings at comic book stores is good for sales. Like
Oh
generally,
yeah.
people walk into a comic book store and there you are as a creator with your wares. You will. I sell more single issue comics at a signing at a 2 hour signing or 3 hour signing at a comic book store than I do in a weekend at a con. Often,
Oh, I
right?
believe that. And I'm
Yeah,
starting to see more libraries doing signings of some sort too. I've seen. I'm
yeah,
I'm starting to see that more.
and that's so. I have not yet published. So, but already I'm talking. I went to the New England uh, Independent Bookseller Association, talked to all my local booksellers. I'm 2 hour drive. I'll come do a signing in your store. At the ALA, I'll come do a signing at your library, right?
Oh
And
yeah.
that's going to start. I've got to start reaching out to all the New England libraries that are within 2 hours and say, I'll be there.
Have you been
Um,
to the New England Kids Con?
I was too late this year. I tried to get a table and they said you're number one on the waiting list.
Because I interviewed Emily, the lady who created it and promotes it. She was on the channel a couple weeks ago. So
She's awesome. So I know
yes,
there's
she
two
is.
a year. This one's in Portland, Maine, right? That's coming up.
Yes.
And
Yep.
then the other one's in New Hampshire. I'm definitely going to be at the one in New Hampshire.
Awesome.
I just was too late for Portland, Maine. But yeah, I love that. And
I
I
do
love
too.
that because I want to reach kids readers with my titles, and comic book stores are not as great at reaching kids readers as a kids Comic-Con, right? That's
Yeah,
like
I'd
the
say it's
place to
nice
go.
to see a convention that's dedicated for kids and families. It's
Yeah.
really nice to see. I live out on the West Coast, and I can't think of any event of that nature. I can't find one. So I would
And
love
we
to.
got to grow our readership, right? Like, so the people who grow up on Marvel and DC and love their comics and support their comic book store and go to cons, they're in their 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s,
Right.
right? So the next generation, you're competing with webtoons and you're competing with streaming TV and you're competing with, blah, blah, blah. So, we got to generate or develop that next generation of comic book readers. And so we got to get kids reading comics again, right?
That's
It's
right.
weird. Like kids, used to be comics were only for kids. Now, hey kids, look, a comic. Read
Hmm.
this. You
And a
might
lot of the
like it.
times too, the kids are not only getting books from the public library, but they're also getting books from the school library. So they're almost double dipping in
Right.
terms of getting access to reading stuff. And a study I read last year, the average like fourth grader is reading 6 to 8 comic or graphic novels a month. So
Fantastic.
they're chunking it up and reading it and just checking them out like constantly.
Well, that's the thing. Graphic novels are definitely building the readership of the next generation. Like my daughter had a hard time reading novels, and then she got into Raina Telgemeier, like many kids,
Yep.
and that opened the door.
I got to
And
meet Raina real briefly at Comic-Con in July this year, and it was like a huge fanboy experience.
yeah, she's amazing, and what she did, for that, particularly for that, girls readership, that
Yes.
teen readership, she's just brilliant. Yeah. And my, Bone, and there's so many great Amulet. Like my son was going to the library and pulling out graphic novels, and I think that's where the readership is coming. The kids are going to the libraries more so
Mm-hmm.
than the comic book stores, but they're still getting that experience. Do you know someone named Moni Barrett?
Yes.
Yeah, so Moni and I did a presentation at the ALA on graphic novels and literacy. And there's a lot of really good research coming out that, it used to be you should read a real book, kid, and
Exactly.
now they're realizing that the development of literacy through graphic novels, it's actually a great way to develop literacy in developing inferencing between panels and
Yes.
and also, not to go on and on, but in terms of representation, because now you
Oh,
got
it's huge.
graphic novels about everybody, and so you can find a graphic novel that suits you, and you're developing your literary skills, and you're developing your reading skills, and yeah, it's
That's
just
right.
awesome. Yeah.
In my last job, they actually, for their adult literacy department, would use comics and graphic novels to help
Yeah.
adults learn how to read and things like that too. So it was really great to hear that.
They do that in
Um,
prisons, right? There's reading programs in prisons, and they use
I'm
graphic
a
novels.
former state prison librarian myself too, and that's kind of where actually I got back into comics. I didn't read comics for probably about 10, 15 years. My inmates who are coming to my prison library is like, hey, why don't you have comics in here? Great
Yeah.
question. So it springboarded. We ended up doing like a summer reading program, a comic book like book club in prison, and it led to some really cool stuff.
That's great. Yeah, I would really love to get involved in like donating graphic novels to prisons. I think it's a great program. But anyway, sorry, we get off topic. I apologize.
No, that's okay. It's part of the whole conversation. So my last question before we go to our closing segment is there any advice that you're willing to share with anyone who's kind of getting into the comic scene and maybe wants to take that jump and make it their full-time gig?
Yeah. It's
challenging.
hard. It's hard. And the economics of comics are really hard.
Yep.
So I think you have to have eyes wide open about what the economics are. However, with that said, the barrier to entry is very low, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you can draw and you got a story, you're in. And there's so many great comics that are being done that are, through small press, like really small press, micro press. There's a great group in Florida called Radiator Comics. And these are not like, super pen and ink, class, they're like more hand drawn, more handmade. And there's
Right.
really an audience for that.
Almost has like that, like a zine or a
Like a
zine feel
zine.
to it.
Yeah, that's what I want. I want to say zine. I'm sorry, I didn't say zine. Yes. So I think really the thing to do is develop your storytelling chops, both in terms of your writing and your art. If you are a creator, like a double threat. I'm a single threat. I only write. So then you're dependent on finding artists and and developing those relationships. And if you have no money, potentially having a story that an artist believes in enough that they'll work on with you. But keep in mind, even with a product that you take to cons and everything else, it is very hard to meet printing costs. It just
Yep.
is. And so having, I just say go into it eyes wide open. And I don't mean to discourage anybody.
Right.
And the other thing is go to Comic Cons and talk to a
Network.
bunch of indie creators. What are you doing? How do you do it? And look at what Dean Haspiel does. Dean Haspiel honestly is the poster child for how to make it as an indie creator. He's got a newsletter. He's got a Substack. He's at every con. He, does Kickstarter. He has mastered every way of surviving as an indie creator, where he can do his own content, his own stories, the way he wants to, and make a living at it.
Love that.
Yeah.
So kind of to start our closing section, where can people find you and SHP Comics online?
Yeah, so everything is SHP Comics. You go to www.shpcomics.com. There's a contact form. I'm the only person who reads that. You can email me there. I'm on all the socials. You can direct message me there. We are SHP Comics everywhere except Twitter. We are SHP_comics. So I'm, Instagram, Facebook. We have a YouTube channel. If you want to watch Technical Support, the short film that was based on the SAX 6000, that's totally free on YouTube. We have over 1 million views. It's hilarious. That's a fun watch. But yeah, and I try to respond to everything. I show up at as many cons as I can. I will be showing up as many libraries as I can. So yeah, I'm out and about, and trying to put more people in place so we can keep this thing going.
Will you be at the ALA next summer in Chicago?
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
Potentially might
the
be
ALA
there.
Is my favorite conference.
It's, now that I've been to comic conventions and I've been to ALA a handful of times, I think ALA, especially in the last couple of years, because the increase of comics publishers and creators that are actually attending, like you're saying, in person, is making it feel more like a comic convention. Yeah, and I love that about it. It's a really cool transition to see.
And librarians are generally great people. They're really open. They're really interested.
Yes,
they want to hear what you're doing.
We're not there to just like buy your works and sell them.
Yeah, like you just having a booth at ALA, I had more great conversations with librarians. It was awesome. Yeah, so I will definitely be in Chicago.
Yes, love to hear that. And you touched on it a little bit, but if you can, share as much as you can about projects or things you have coming out in the next 6 to 12 months.
Yeah. So Ziki, which we didn't talk about, but it's the manga Western fantasy mashup, cheeky, funny, Naruto-esque in the sense that the main character likes to insult his enemies, and that's in comic book stores now. Issue 2 hit the shelves a week ago, or hits the shelves. I can't remember. I think this maybe tomorrow. Anyway, issue 2 is coming out if it's not out. And then one a month. Eratech issue 1 hits the shelves November 19th. We sold a bunch of those to retailers. We have a great variant cover by Howard Chaykin, from American Flag. Yeah, Howard did us right with a great variant. That was a 1 in 5 variant. They had to buy 5 regulars to buy the Chaykins. The Chaykin's worth, they're already trading him on eBay.
Oh, yeah. So selling him on eBay.
Yeah, he's a legend. So go ask your comic book store about Eratech, issue 1 on the 19th. Tales from Eratech, the truly naughty anthology, is in comic book stores on December 10th. So as much as you can go to your comic book retailers and say, hey, order me that SHP book, that's wonderful. Right. Because it's customer demand that gets us attention from the retailers.
And the question I have is, does Lunar actually put out like a monthly catalog, like a previews, kind of like Diamond did? Do they put out anything like that?
It's only online, and I believe you have to be signed up to view it in detail. Right? I can go to it. You go to lunardistribution.com, and you search for Ziki, you will see all my titles. But if you try to get a lot more detail or whatever, you kind of hit the place where you have to log in now. Yeah. And then in terms of graphic novels, Ziki, the graphic novel launches on March 7th. Woodstake, the graphic novel launches on April 10th. And then in terms of special previews for you fans who are still listening, Woodstake 99, the sequel, which is going to end the story, is
nice.
3 issues in, and we're going to have a Kickstarter next year. There will be two, if you sign up for our newsletter, there's going to be two novels I'm going to announce from our acquisition from Frankfurt, hopefully soon. I am working on something that is a reimagining of Beowulf that takes place in two time periods. That's going to hit next year. I have got a sci-fi horror with once again a big kind of fun concept behind it that's going to hit next year, and potentially one of the classic some classic horror tales are with great art are going to hit next year. So yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff coming down the pipe, and then in the fall, the Aerotech graphic novel, the Beowulf graphic novel, and the Killing Machine, all graphic novels. So yeah, lots coming out.
So 2026 is going to be a banner year.
It's going to be a banner year. Yeah, this is the year I hope we hit the map and start finding some fans beyond Kickstarter and on all of that. So expand the universe.
And then my question to close us out. Yes. Do you have a favorite snack or a meal as your go-to when you're working on a project?
Peanut butter and jelly.
The classics.
Yeah. When I don't want to stop to eat, it's like 2 pieces of toast and peanut butter and jelly and right back to the computer. Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that concludes our interview today. Thank you, Shawn, so much for taking some time out of your busy schedule, I'm sure. It's been a wonderful, engaging conversation, and thank you for joining Comix for All today. Again, everyone out there, I will post this on YouTube within the next couple hours so you can watch the entire thing. But again, thank you for joining us for Comix for All today, wherever you are, where comics, creativity, and community all connect. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Hey, there you are.